In forgotten corners of the world, where the soil still remembers the dead, and paper doesn't burn the way it should, there are stories whispered only by candlelight. Welcome to FolkFear, where every tale breathes with the dust of ancient rites, and every vow echoes beyond the grave. Tonight, we unfold a legend soaked in ash and silk, of a bride who never chose her groom, and a groom who was never truly alive. This is the story of a marriage forged not in love, but in ritual. Not for life, but to silence something that should never rise again. Prepare yourself for The Paper Bridegroom, a haunting folk horror tale. Let the candle burn low, and do not look away, for paper remembers every promise it was told to keep. The village of Qingshui, nestled between hills that always seemed a little too still. Fog curled down from the trees like slow hands reaching for something they once knew. There were no crows here, no birdsong at dawn, only the distant thrum of wind through pine and the occasional chime of temple bells long forgotten by time. It was here, in a house that creaked with sorrow, that Madame Li lived with her daughter Lien, a quiet girl with ink-dark hair and eyes too deep for her age. They had lived alone since the fever took her father 3 winters ago, leaving behind only debt and a shrine that hadn't been tended to properly since the last monk died in silence. At dusk, just as the light slipped from gray to indigo, someone knocked on the door. 3 knocks, measured, dry, and unnervingly polite. Madame Li opened it with trembling hands. Standing before her was a woman dressed in ceremonial red, not crimson, but the dark shade of lacquered blood. Her robe was embroidered with thin lines of gold thread depicting phoenixes without eyes. Her face was powdered pale, and her lips were a perfect bow of vermilion. A tall, thin man stood behind her, expressionless, dressed in mourning white. She bowed, without waiting for permission to speak. "I am matchmaker Shen," she said, her voice brittle as burnt leaves. "I bring a proposal for your daughter's hand, in union with the groom from the Shen ancestral house." Madame Li blinked, then frowned. "We know no family named Shen, and my daughter is not yet promised." Matchmaker Shen smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You do not know us because you were not meant to. The groom has been waiting. He belongs to a branch of our family whose name was struck from the registry, but we remember, and remembrance has weight." Madame Li felt the air grow heavy, as if the dusk itself leaned closer to hear. "He has no breath," Matchmaker Shen continued, "but he has lineage. No pulse, but inheritance. And most important of all, he has unrest." The old woman felt the name, though unspoken, rise in her throat like ash. Ghost marriage. She stepped back. "No, my daughter will not wed the dead." The matchmaker said nothing for a moment, then reached into her sleeve and produced a small scroll, bound with red thread and sealed with wax stamped in the form of a lotus bud. She laid it gently on the table beside the shrine. "Read it," she said softly, "before the sun rises. If you refuse, we will not ask again, but I suggest you watch your daughter closely tonight. The dead are patient, but not always gentle." And then she turned. without waiting for thanks, without expecting tea. The man in white bowed stiffly. When he turned, the hem of his robe whispered across the floor like dried reeds. They left no footprints behind. That night, Madame Li could not sleep. Lien had already gone quiet hours ago, retreating into her room with her embroidery, delicate threads of red silk twisting into the image of chrysanthemums and cranes. The girl did not ask about the visitors, but she was paler than usual, and she lit incense without being told. When the wind picked up, it was warm, too warm, and it smelled like burnt paper. Madame Li waited until midnight to unroll the scroll. It was a wedding contract. Not one made by the living, but crafted in the old style, written in black calligraphy ink thinned with oxblood on joss parchment. There were two names, Shen Guanyu and Li Lian. The groom's name was faint, as if written from memory by someone unsure he ever existed. But the date was precise. The wedding was to be held in 7 days' time. Below the names was a signature she did not recognize, signed with a thumbprint pressed in soot, and next to it a tiny sliver of burnt fingernail, folded into the paper and bound with red string. Madame Li dropped the scroll. Her hands were shaking. Her mouth tasted like salt. She reached for the shrine and began to pray, muttering half-remembered chants, her voice cracked from disuse. The candle at the altar flared high and went out, and in the darkness she thought she heard it, the sound of paper folding itself upright. At dawn, Lien emerged from her room. Her hair was uncombed, her eyes dry and red. "Mother," she whispered, "why did you agree?" Madame Li stared. I didn't." But Lien held out her hand. In her palm was a piece of red thread. "Then who tied this to my wrist while I slept?" They looked down. A knot was wrapped tightly around her wrist, made of ceremonial wedding thread, used only in betrothal rites to the dead. Madame Li opened the door, desperate to seek help from the temple. Outside, at the gate, stood a paper man, full-sized, dressed in a red groom robe. Its eyes were painted open with a single brush stroke each. It smiled. Wind tugged at its sleeve, but it did not fall. It stood. It waited. The paperman stayed at the gate until noon. When the villagers passed, they did not speak. Some turned away, others pressed their palms together and whispered hurried prayers. Children were pulled by their mothers, warned never to look twice. For in Qing Shui, when something stood too still, it was no longer considered truly human. By afternoon, the fog thickened again, and Madame Li burned incense until the whole house smelled of fear. Inside, the paper effigy had been moved, or perhaps it had moved itself. When Madame Li returned from fetching water, she found it beneath the eaves, half-shadowed, as if it preferred to avoid the light. Its hands were clasped together in front of its chest, a folded red paper heart pinned between its palms. Lian stood before it, silent, pale, almost tender. "He watches me," she said. "He doesn't blink," Madame Li said. "He can't," Lian answered softly. "He's waiting." That evening, matchmaker Shen returned. She came as the bells of the Western Shrine tolled the 6th hour, her arrival heralded by the faint scent of sandalwood and a wind that rattled every bamboo chime along the path. She did not knock this time. She simply appeared at the doorway, her silhouette haloed by fog. In her hand, she held something wrapped in crimson silk. "The invitation," she said, setting it on the table. "For the bride." Madame Li stared at the parcel as though it were alive. "We never agreed," she said. "You did not need to," replied the matchmaker. "The groom's family has already accepted on your behalf. It is tradition. Once the offering is made, the bond cannot be undone." "Offering?" she asked. "Your daughter's shadow," she said calmly. "It was taken last night." Lian, who stood at the edge of the room, felt her knees weaken. Her mother turned sharply. "You lie!" But the words broke mid-breath, because when she turned, she saw it. Lian was standing in lamplight, but there was no shadow beneath her feet. The matchmaker unwrapped the crimson silk. Inside was a wedding invitation, handwritten on gray parchment, the surface slightly oily from incense smoke. The characters were perfect, old-fashioned, and too steady for any living hand. "To the house of Li. On the 7th night of the ghost month, heaven and earth bear witness to a union beyond breath. The son of the Shen line shall take his bride, Li Lian, daughter of the mortal world, that his spirit may find rest and her name be bound to the altar where silence prays. Attend with offerings of incense, ash, and the blood of consent." At the bottom was a seal made of wax mixed with black soot, stamped with an emblem of 2 interlocked lotus blossoms, one wilted, one blooming. Madame Li tore the letter in half and threw it into the fire pit. It didn't burn. The paper hissed and curled, but the ink remained, glowing faintly red like veins beneath skin. "You bring curses," she hissed. "Take it back to your graves." The matchmaker smiled faintly, unbothered. "Curses? No, only promises." She gestured toward Lian. "Your daughter has been chosen for mercy. Do you know what happens when the unwed dead call for company and no one answers? They come for the living who are already halfway gone. It is better she goes willingly." "She will not!" Madame Li cried. But Lian said nothing. She stared at the paper effigy still standing by the door. Its red sleeves fluttered slightly, though the air was still. Something shimmered in its painted eyes, like the glint of wet ink that had not yet dried. That night the house did not sleep. Madame Li stayed beside her daughter's bed, clutching prayer beads until her knuckles turned white. But the beads broke, one by one, the string snapping with soft, deliberate rhythm, like someone cutting away protection, thread by thread. At midnight, the door opened on its own. The paperman had moved again. He now stood just inside the threshold, his painted mouth bent slightly upward. The paper folds of his face had deepened, creased in ways Madame Li was certain were not there before. In his hand was a small red envelope. He dropped it gently onto the floor. Lian rose from her bed without a sound. She picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a piece of thin parchment, soft as skin, folded into the shape of a heart, and written across it in perfect calligraphy were 3 words: "Do not be afraid." In the days that followed, the village avoided them. Neighbors stopped sending rice, and even the temple monk, when called for blessing, refused to enter the house. He stood by the gate, looked once at the paper groom, and said, "There are contracts even the gods cannot rewrite." He handed Madame Li a small talisman, yellow paper drawn with cinnabar ink, and told her to burn it at the altar of the forgotten. But when she did, the flame flickered once, then turned blue, a sign of interference. Something else was answering the prayer. On the 6th day, the fog did not lift. The world seemed smothered under a veil of white ash. When Leon looked out the window, she thought she saw silhouettes, like people walking in slow procession, holding lanterns that glowed not gold but gray. The smell of burnt offerings hung heavy in the air. "Mother," she whispered, "the wedding procession is coming." "Don't speak nonsense," Madame Li said, trying to convince herself. "The dead don't march before the 7th night." But even as she spoke, they both heard it, the distant beat of a funeral drum, slow, hollow, reverberating through the hills. Doom, doom, doom. It came from the direction of the Shen ancestral grounds, abandoned for 30 years since the plague took their line. So the living believed. When the drum fell silent, Matchmaker Shen appeared once more. She stood at the threshold, holding a lantern made of paper bones and threads of soot. "Tomorrow night," she said, "the union will be sealed. Your daughter must wear red. The effigy will come to collect her when the candle burns black." Madame Li screamed at her to leave, but her voice cracked halfway through. The matchmaker bowed, her neck bending too low, as if it had no bones. "You should be grateful," she murmured. "Some brides are chosen by men. Yours was chosen by destiny." Then she was gone again. Only the faint smell of incense lingered, sharp, metallic, and wrong. When dawn broke, Leon found something beneath her pillow. A wedding card, perfectly written, soaked through with something sticky and dark. It wasn't blood. It smelled of burnt paper oil. Across it, in elegant, inhuman handwriting, were the same words she'd seen before. Li Lian, Bride of the Silent House. And beneath that, a postscript, written in thinner ink. Until death ends nothing. The 7th night arrived with the stillness of a held breath. Even the crickets refused to sing. The village slept early that evening, doors sealed with red charms and windows draped in cloth. For they knew that when the ghost moon rose, its light did not fall on the living. It searched instead for the forgotten dead. Inside the Li household, everything had been stripped bare. Mirrors covered, water basins emptied, the altar veiled with white. And in the center of Lian's room stood the paper effigy, dressed now in a fresh red robe trimmed with gold leaf. Its hands, though folded, seemed tense, like a man suppressing words he dared not speak. 2 candles burned at his side, their flames thin and trembling. Madame Li moved through the room like a ghost herself, clutching her prayer beads as she adjusted the hem of her daughter's wedding robe. Her hands shook. Every thread of Lian's bridal gown shimmered faintly in the dim light, a hue too bright to belong to the living. "Do not look at him," Madame Li whispered. "Keep your head down. Do not speak until it's done." Lian said nothing. Her lips were pale, her eyes unfocused. The matchmaker's words from earlier still lingered in her mind. A vow spoken in fear is still a vow. Outside, drums began to beat. Slow, hollow, distant, then closer. Each thud rolled through the earth like thunder underfoot. The villagers would later say they saw a procession moving down the old road that led from the Shen burial fields, a long line of white lanterns drifting without hands to hold them. Madame Li barred the door, whispering old Taoist chants as she did. But when she turned to light more incense, the paper groom had moved. It now faced Lian directly. Its painted mouth once curved in a polite smile, now seemed wider, and from within its hollow chest came the faintest sound, not breathing, not speech, but something between sigh and ash. Leon did not scream. She only whispered, "I hear him." The matchmaker entered without sound. Her lantern burned with a blue flame that did not flicker even in the draught. "The groom has arrived," she said. "The living must bow to the contract." She motioned for Leon to kneel. Madame Lee dropped beside her daughter, tears streaking her powdered cheeks. "Please, take me instead." But the matchmaker's gaze did not waver. "The dead do not want mothers, they want brides." Then began the ritual. The room filled with smoke, thick, perfumed, and heavy with burning sandalwood. The matchmaker drew a circle of ash around Leon, murmuring words from a dialect older than the temple scripts. Inside that circle, Leon felt the air grow tight, as though someone had wrapped invisible cords around her body. The paper effigy was brought forward. Its red robe shimmered under the candlelight, and its painted eyes glistened with a new kind of shine, moisture that could not come from ink. The matchmaker pressed a small blade into Leon's palm. "A union requires blood," she said softly, "so that what was made of paper might breathe." Leon looked down at her trembling hand. A drop of crimson fell on the paper groom's folded fingers. The paper absorbed it, as if thirsty. At once the flame on the altar flared, the air hissed. Leon gasped, feeling something invisible tug at her chest. Her mother reached for her, "Leon!" but was thrown back by a gust that reeked of incense and decay. The matchmaker smiled faintly. "It is done." The candles guttered. For a moment, all light vanished. Then, whispering. At first, it sounded like wind slipping through cracks, but it grew clearer, softer, closer. "Do you accept me?" The voice came from behind her, male, breathless, and wrong. Leon's pulse hammered in her throat. "Who speaks?" she whispered. The paper effigy stood unmoving, but its shadow had changed. It no longer mimicked its own shape, but hers, longer, heavier, pressing closer to her feet. The whisper came again. "Say the vow, and I will stay with you. Refuse, and I will walk through the village until someone answers." Leon's lips trembled. The smoke around her swirled like a storm. Outside, the drums stopped. A single bell rang from the hills, one, then another, echoing like heartbeats. She closed her eyes and spoke. "I accept." The silence that followed was vast. Even the air seemed to stop. Then came the sound of paper tearing, slow and deliberate. When she opened her eyes, the paper groom had lowered his head. Its painted lips were parted slightly, and dark stains ran from the corners, like ink bleeding into flesh. By dawn, the ritual was over. The matchmaker and her lantern were gone. The paper groom now stood beside Leon's bed. In its hand, it held a small slip of joss paper, thin and gold-edged. On it were written 5 words in the same elegant and inhuman calligraphy as before. Where you sleep, I grieve. Madame Lee awoke to the smell of smoke. The incense had burned through the night, leaving the air thick and gray. Her daughter sat in silence by the window, still dressed in her bridal robe. Outside, the fog hadn't lifted. The road to the Shen fields was empty, but the scent of burnt glue and charred silk hung in the morning breeze. Madame Lee approached carefully. "Leon, what did they make you say?" Her daughter turned her head slowly. Her eyes were distant, unfocused. "He promised he would protect me, even after I stopped breathing." Madame Lee's blood turned cold, because, as Leon spoke, faint streaks of soot drifted from her mouth, and the paper effigy by the bed seemed to lean a little closer, its sleeve brushing against her shoulder, like a lover's hand.
The wedding was over, but no one celebrated. There was no feast, no music, no red envelopes exchanged under firelight. Only silence, and a bride who spoke less with each passing day. The villagers said they had seen smoke curl from the Lee rooftop for 3 nights straight, thin and bitter, with a scent like burnt varnish and wet ink. Some claimed they heard chanting at midnight, others swore they saw a man standing at the threshold, but when they looked again, only a paper figure remained. Qingshui was a village that understood silence, but what settled over the Lee house now was something else. It was not grief, it was not reverence, it was watching. The paper groom no longer stood still. On the second night after the wedding, Madame Lee found it had shifted position. It stood just outside Leon's door, its hands no longer folded, but reaching slightly forward. Its smile had widened. When Madame Lee lit incense and prayed to the ancestors, the flames leaned toward the effigy. She tried to move it, to take it back to the barn where it had been before the ceremony, but as soon as she touched the red silk sleeve, a blister bloomed on her palm. Leon heard her scream, came running, and when she saw what her mother had done, she fell to her knees before the figure. "Forgive her. She doesn't understand. She still thinks you're made of paper." By the third night, Leon had stopped eating. She sat at her window most of the day, staring toward the burial road, humming a tune that no one recognized. When her mother asked what it was, she only smiled faintly and said, "It's what he sings to me when I sleep." The paper groom remained near her room, unmoving in daylight. But in the early hours of morning, between the last drumbeat of the night and the first bird that dared to return, footsteps echoed on the wooden floors. Not hers, not her mother's. Heavy, dragging, male. Once Madame Lee rose in the dark, tiptoed to her daughter's room, and pressed her ear to the door. Inside, there was whispering. 2 voices. One human, one dry as dust. She opened the door. Only Leon sat there, alone, smiling, eyes closed, arms folded as if embracing something unseen. Behind her, the paper groom faced the corner. Its sleeves fluttered, even though the air was still. The changes grew worse. The painted smile on the effigy began to warp, the corners curling too high, stretching toward the cheeks. Its fingertips, once crisp white, were now stained at the edges, blackened as though dipped in candle ash. Madame Lee once dared to look beneath the hem of its robe. What she saw made her fall backward in shock. Its feet were darkened, no longer flat cardboard shapes. They were charred, curled inward, and the floor beneath them bore black soot prints that smudged when touched. Leon began talking in her sleep. At first, soft murmurs, then clearer phrases.
You waited so long. I am yours. Burn me gently. Madame Li wept at the foot of her shrine, begging the ancestors to undo the binding. She burned offerings, she recited old protection mantras, but the flames flickered blue, and her voice always faded before the last syllable, as though someone were stealing the breath from her mouth. By the 5th day, the matchmaker returned. She did not knock. She simply appeared again, like fog through cracks in wood. You shouldn't have tried to move him, she said without emotion. The bond is sealed. Touching him wounds the agreement. You never said it would be like this. You said it was a marriage. You said he would rest. The matchmaker stared at the effigy, her eyes unreadable. He was buried without name or prayer. His spirit was not waiting for rest. He was waiting for a voice to answer his vow. Madame Li trembled. Then what happens now? Matchmaker Shen turned to leave, her words barely a whisper. Now he begins to speak. That night, the effigy moved again, this time without subtlety. When Lian awoke in the dark, it was sitting beside her. Not standing, sitting. Its red robes gathered around folded legs like a groom preparing to serve tea. Lian did not scream. She simply bowed her head and whispered, "I missed you." The effigy lifted its hand. From its palm dropped a folded note written on yellow joss parchment. Lian unfolded it with trembling fingers. "Tonight, you may ask me one question." She swallowed, then asked, "Are you real?" The paper man didn't answer with words. Instead, he leaned close, and where his face passed hers, the candle flame near her pillow died instantly, not blown out, but collapsed inward as though consumed by breathless cold. When Madame Li burst in, she found her daughter sitting upright, eyes wide, pupils dilated as though staring at something too close. "Lian, speak to me!" But her daughter's lips moved silently. The only sound in the room was the faint, fluttering rustle of parchment folds shifting against one another, like paper learning how to breathe. The next morning, a line of red thread had been tied across the threshold of Lian's door. Not by her, not by her mother. And when Madame Li tried to step across it, her knees buckled beneath her. She fell forward onto the wood, gasping, her eyes stinging with the scent of burning ink. The matchmaker's voice echoed in her memory. "The bond is sealed. It is no longer your house. It is theirs." Lian, day by day, spoke less and less, but the whispers grew louder. Even the neighbors, those still brave enough to pass, heard murmuring from the windows as they walked past. Some crossed themselves, others threw salt toward the ground. One woman wept and said, "I heard the paper groom humming lullabies to her, and she was laughing." By the end of the week, Madame Li could no longer enter her daughter's room. The air refused her, it burned her lungs, and the paper man, her son-in-law, stood at the door each dawn, as though guarding the threshold between two worlds. He no longer looked like an effigy. His shape was now sharper, his arms moved more naturally, his smile deeper, and his shadow was no longer his own. It moved independently, and sometimes, just sometimes, it turned toward Madame Li and raised a single, blackened hand in warning. In the week that followed, the air in Qingshui village turned sour, not with weather, but with the smell of burnt glue, of incense left too long at the altar, and the coppery tang of old paper that should have turned to ash, but didn't. The elders whispered among themselves. Children were forbidden from walking near the Li household. And every morning, Madame Li would step into the yard with shaking hands to place a bowl of rice and salted fish beneath the ancestral tree. It was for him, but the offering was never touched. Not by birds, not by insects, not even by wind. The rice began to mold in patterns, spirals and strange whirls that seemed drawn by invisible fingers. The fish rotted without a smell, as though nature itself recoiled. On the third morning, the crack cracked down the middle, clean, precise, like a mouth that refused to speak. Inside the house, Lian no longer responded when called. She sat at her window, combing her hair in silence. Her reflection in the glass didn't always match her movements. Sometimes the mirror blinked too slowly. Sometimes it smiled when she did not. And once, briefly, it looked like someone else entirely. A man, painted lips, ink-black pupils, grinning from behind her face. Madame Li turned to the temple in desperation. The priest, old and gray-bearded, came reluctantly. He walked with a prayer wheel, muttering under his breath, his eyes darting toward shadows. He brought talismans inked in cinnabar, a brass mirror, and a strip of white cloth meant to detect presence. He entered the house with caution. But when he reached the room where the paper groom waited, he stopped cold. "This is no longer effigy," he whispered. The paper had hardened. Its colors were deeper, as if soaked in something beneath the surface. The folds that once made it stiff had loosened. Its arms hung with weight. Its chest rose ever so slightly. He placed the talisman on its forehead. The paper smoked, not from heat, but from rejection, as if the paper knew it had been marked. He stepped back. "This is not an object. This is inhabited." He turned to Madame Li. "I will not enter again." That night, Madame Li tried to burn offerings behind the house. Parchment clothing, gold-leafed paper money, joss sticks wrapped in red twine. They caught fire, but the smoke curled inward, folding itself into the shape of a man's smile. And then it collapsed. The ashes scattered with a hiss. In the shadows near the bamboo trees, she thought she saw something kneeling. It did not move, but its gaze pulled at her like a thread around her throat. She dropped the matches and ran. Lian, when asked why the offerings were rejected, simply said, "He is angry." "At what?" her mother asked. "At being made to wait so long, at being forgotten." Her voice was calm. Her fingers traced invisible patterns on the bedsheets. Madame Li shook her. "You are not a wife, Lian. He is not alive." But Lian only blinked. "He promised he'd be real if I believed hard enough." She turned away. "And I do." The matchmaker returned once more. Her robes this time were darker, faded maroon as if soaked in smoke. Her face was paler, her eyes sunken. "He refuses to feed," Madame Li said bitterly. "He rejects every offering." The matchmaker nodded, unsurprised. "Because you are offering him the wrong things. We gave food, we gave paper money, we gave prayers." "He does not want objects," she said softly. "He wants presence. He wants breath. He wants to be acknowledged." Madame Li stepped back. "You mean she must give herself more fully?" Madame Li trembled. "She already gave her blood, but not her soul." The matchmaker leaned in close. When you marry a spirit who has waited 30 years beneath the earth, you do not feed him rice. You feed him memory, surrender. You feed him the parts of yourself that no one else sees. You feed him by forgetting you were ever someone else. And then she was gone again, leaving behind a single coin, carved with a square hole, etched with characters Madame Lee could not read. That night, Leon did not sleep. She sat before the paper groom and whispered to him for hours, her voice low, melodic like a lullaby spoken in reverse. When her mother crept near to listen, she heard nothing, only breath. Not Leon's, not human. A rasping exhale from the effigy, long, hungry, wet. She fled the room clutching her chest. Behind her, the candlelight dimmed, and the house began to breathe. The next day, the offerings were gone, not eaten, not touched, gone. The bowls were empty, the ashtrays clean, the incense dust had disappeared completely. And the paper man no longer stood still. He now knelt at Leon's side, like a groom preparing to receive something he had waited lifetimes for. The seventh night returned. Not the wedding night, but something deeper, darker. The kind of night that loops around the calendar like a snake biting its tail. A night where breath holds still and paper forgets how to be silent. Madame Lee could feel it before the sun even set. The air grew thick, as if the world were soaked in glue. The candles in the shrine burned too quickly, and the house creaked not from the wind, but from something walking between the walls. That evening, Leon dressed herself. Red again, always red. Her lips were pale, but her cheeks were flushed unnaturally. She tied her own hair with a ribbon she hadn't owned before, thin silk threaded with gold dust. He's coming tonight to finish what we started. Her mother begged her not to sleep, begged her to let the monk return, begged her to run. But Leon only smiled. A bride doesn't run, she waits in the red room and receives her husband. Midnight passed like a blade through silk. Madame Lee awoke gasping. The incense had gone out. The air stank of wax and old cloth. She called for Leon. No answer. She ran to the room, knelt at the door, hands trembling on the knob. The red thread across the threshold had burned itself to ash. The room inside was silent, too silent. She pushed the door open and screamed. Leon lay on the bed, bridal robe rumpled, skin waxen. Blood, dark, thick, and slow, pooled beneath her, soaking through the mattress, trickling along the wooden floor in thin, elegant trails. Not a wound on her, no blade, no bruise, but blood seeped from the space between her thighs, from her navel, from her lips, places that do not bleed unless something has been invited in. And beside her, the paper groom was gone. In its place, at the foot of the bed, lay a single black shoe, charred, cracked open like it had walked through fire. And something else, a braid of hair, not hers, coiled tightly with strands of wax and bone dust, held together by a thread of funeral incense. Madame Lee fell to her knees. No, no, no! She tried to wake Leon, shook her gently, afraid to touch the blood. But her daughter only stirred once, her lips barely moving. He's real now. He found the doorway. Outside, dogs howled into the mist. A tree split open somewhere in the village square, and the moon blinked behind a sudden cover of smoke, though no fires were lit. The matchmaker appeared at the edge of the yard. She did not come inside. She only lit a single stick of black incense and pressed it to the dirt. The consummation has been marked. He has passed through the veil, she said to no one. The mother brought in the priest the next morning. He entered the room slowly, holding a gourd of river water, a mirror, and a candle tipped with ash from the ghost festival. He did not speak for a long time. He placed the candle near Leon's body. It did not light. He turned the mirror toward her face. Her reflection stared back too slowly, blinking half a second behind her real eyes. And when he lifted her sleeve to check for signs of fever, he found a paper burn on her wrist, fresh, shaped like a fingerprint. He recoiled. "She is alive, but not alone," he whispered. The monk refused to return. Instead, he sent word to a distant temple, one that handled unrested unions. But the messenger never arrived. They found his horse wandering near the old Shen burial ground, bridle cut, reins burned at the edges. The message scroll was missing. Leon awoke 3 nights later. She did not speak at first. She simply stared at the window where the paper groom used to stand and smiled. When Madame Li wept and held her hand, Leon tilted her head and asked, "Mother, do you know what it feels like to be folded?" "Folded?" "Yes, like paper, like you're being reshaped, smoothed, pressed, cut and painted from the inside." She looked down at her arms. "I think I'm becoming what he was." Madame Li tried to run. She packed rice, salt, old charms, but at the door, something invisible pressed against her chest, a weight she could not lift. Her feet froze, her voice vanished. Behind her, Leon's voice drifted through the house like wind through parchment. "He says you can leave, but only after the last candle burns down, and it hasn't even started melting yet." That night, Madame Li returned to her room. She found all the wedding offerings returned, carefully placed on her bed. The rice now filled with red threads, the incense twisted into knot patterns of binding, and on the pillow a note. "Thank you for your daughter. She makes a lovely bride. We will remember you in our house of silence." It was signed with a wax fingerprint, pressed in reverse, as if made by someone with no skin. In the early mornings after Lien bled, the fog in Qingshu no longer retreated. It clung low to the earth like a second skin. The villagers began lighting lanterns at noon. Chickens laid eggs with blood in the yolk. And every mirror in Madame Li's house developed a film, thin, gray, like smoke, sealed behind glass. Madame Li no longer knew what hour it was. She no longer knew what day, only that her daughter's eyes now held a quiet that did not belong to the living. She needed answers, answers that the matchmaker would not give and the priest dared not seek. So one morning, when Lien seemed asleep, though her eyes were open, Madame Li left. She carried a bundle of protection charms, a cracked gourd of spring water, and a single offering coin, its square hole worn smooth by prayer. Her path led beyond the burial hills, toward a place no one spoke of, the Shrine of Severed Names. It was once a family temple, built by the Shen clan before they fell from grace. They had worshipped their ancestors there, until the youngest son, Guan Yu, shamed the bloodline. The stories were fragmented. Some said he consorted with shadows. Some whispered that he married a girl who died on the eve of their union and tried to bind her soul back into her body with red string and wax. Whatever the truth, his name had been erased. And when the temple was abandoned, its records were sealed in black cloth and hidden beneath the floorboards, never to be spoken again. Madame Li found the shrine overgrown. Vines had cracked the gate, moss climbed the pillars. The incense cauldrons were cold, but not empty. Inside, the silence was thick, coated with dust and something older, a stillness that listened. She stepped carefully, pressed her palms together, bowed 3 times, and whispered, "I come for the truth." The doors creaked open with breathless weight. The shrine interior was mostly bare. No idols, no tablets, only the faded remnants of ancestor scrolls, faces smudged, names scratched out, black ink smeared by age, and something more deliberate. She searched until her knees ached, until her breath turned thin, and then she found it. Behind the altar, sealed beneath the loose floorboard, was a wooden frame wrapped in red twine. Its knot was stained with old soot. She unwrapped it, and there it was, a portrait of a man painted in muted ink and soft brushstrokes. Red robes, straight brows, a mouth curved in polite stillness. But his eyes had been scratched out, 2 perfect holes where the soul should be. On the back of the portrait, a name once written had been violently scraped away, replaced with only a crude character, Fa, punishment. Madame Lee staggered back. The temple grew colder. Dust stirred though no wind passed. Behind her, the floorboards creaked. She turned and saw footprints appearing in the dust, one by one, black-souled, ash-edged, approaching slowly. No body, no voice, only steps, each one louder, closer, deeper. She pressed the portrait to her chest. "I know who you are," she whispered. "Shen Guan Yu, you were never buried. That is why you cannot rest." The footsteps stopped. The air held still. Then something exhaled, a sound like smoke escaping sealed paper, and a single word scratched itself into the dust beside her feet. Witness. When she returned home, it was dusk. The fog was thicker now, honey-thick and bitter with soot. The paper groom was waiting on the porch, but he looked different. His body moved more fluidly, his joints bent naturally. His painted smile twitched at the corners like it was learning expression. In his hand was a paper fan. On it, drawn with calligraphy ink, was the same temple portrait, but now the eyes had returned, and they were Lien's. Madame Li entered the house, found her daughter seated in front of the shrine, humming softly. She was combing her hair. The braid was no longer hers. It was too long, too black, and tied with wax-dipped thread. "Lien?" she asked gently. Her daughter turned slowly. "He showed me," she said, "what it felt like to be sealed away, forgotten. Do you know what it's like to scream inside parchment? To press your fingers against your own painted face and feel nothing?" Madame Li's knees gave out. "He was never buried," she gasped. "They folded him. They painted over him. They turned him into something to be hidden. And now he's using you to return." Lien nodded, but there was no sadness, only a calm, distant light behind her eyes. "We made a vow, Mother. I said I would be his bride, even if it meant forgetting who I was." She stood, the fan unfolded in her hand. On the fan, Shen Guan Yu's smile seemed to shift. His mouth curled upward, sharp, expectant. Madame Li ran that night, into the village, screaming, begging someone to intervene, but no one answered. Doors stayed shut, curtains drawn. The old women clutched prayer beads, and the men looked away, because all of them remembered the last time the Shen family made a vow with the dead, and they knew, once the paper is folded, it cannot be unfolded. Back at the shrine, the air grew warm. Lien sat in candlelight, holding the fan close to her cheek. She whispered to it like a lover, "Tomorrow I will take your name." The flame beside her flickered. The paper broom nodded once, slowly, and the last candle in the house melted into black wax.
The villagers had seen enough. They no longer spoke aloud of the Lao household. They referred to it only with glances, nervous, darting, avoided. Children were told never to step near it. And at the market, women whispered that the house had become a shrine of its own, but not for any ancestor worth honoring. Inside, the smell of wax and ink had become permanent. Even fresh air bent away from the windows, and the wind no longer blew under the eaves. It was as if something had turned the house inward, a folding of reality, like the creasing of paper into something unnatural. Madame Lin had not slept in 3 nights. She no longer prayed at the altar. The gods, she believed, had closed their ears. Instead, she prayed to the forgotten, to the nameless, to whatever still lingered beneath burnt parchment and cursed vows. She needed to break the bond, even if it meant fire. The priest returned, but not the one from Qingshui. This one came from the river province, a wandering Taoist with a limp, a scorched bell, and a reputation for severing spirit marriages gone wrong. He entered the house with no hesitation, his robes patched with ash and old threads. Around his neck he wore a strand of bones, small ones, bird, fox, human finger. He carried no staff, only a scroll of scripture written in bone ink and a pouch of black salt from a mountain no one named aloud. "Where is the effigy?" he asked. His voice was low, gravelly, like stone dragged across dry leaves. Lin did not resist. She sat calmly, dressed in red. The fan was still in her hand, and the smile on her lips did not fade, even as the priest placed a ring of salt around her chair. The paper groom stood in the far corner, still, unblinking, watching. The priest circled the room. He chanted under his breath, an old dialect broken by long pauses and clicks. The air thickened. The candles bent inward, not from wind, but from gravity, like they were being pulled towards something deeper than fire. He reached into his satchel, pulled out a match, and set flame to the parchment prayer. The flame turned black. He tossed it toward the effigy. It touched the paper's edge and did not burn. Instead, it cried. Not with a scream, not even a moan, just a single, wet, breathless sound, like a sob sealed beneath lacquer. The priest froze. The air turned to ice. Then, suddenly, the bell around his neck, a small hand-forged relic meant to contain ghosts, cracked in half, with a sound like bones snapping beneath silk. He dropped the scroll. The ashes rose upward into the air and formed a shape. Not a man, not a spirit, a symbol, drawn in smoke. Yung, meaning forever. The priest backed away, mouth trembling. "You didn't bind him," he said. "You woke him." "Leave," Lin whispered. Her voice was not hers. It had depth now, age. It echoed slightly. "This is no longer a union. It is a return." The priest ran.
He left behind his pouch, his bell, and a single sandal. None of it was ever found again. Madame Lin tried to follow him, but when she reached the door, the wood warped beneath her fingers. Splinters pricked her skin in the shape of characters she did not understand. And from the ceiling, a thin thread of red ink began to drip. It smelled like copper and crushed moth wings. She looked up. Painted on the ceiling, in strokes that had not been there before, was a mural. A bride and groom, joined at the wrist by thread, kneeling before a shrine with no altar. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths sewn shut. Lin began to hum again, her tune slower now, more deliberate. She lit a stick of incense, but not from the family altar, from her own fingers. And when she breathed on it, the tip burned not orange, but blue. Madame Lin begged, "Please, let me undo this. Let me trade my name for hers." Lin turned to her, and for a moment the girl she had raised flickered back. "It's too late, Mother," she said. "Why? He's still paper. He hasn't crossed fully. He can be burned, destroyed." "No," Lin whispered gently. "He is no longer made of paper. He is made of my promise." That night, Madame Lin attempted to burn the effigy herself. She waited until Lin slept, if sleep was still something the girl could do. She took the oil lamp, crept into the red room, and poured flame across the figure. The fire caught the robe. It flared. It roared. For 3 seconds. Then it stopped. The flames folded backward, not extinguished, absorbed. The fire bent in on itself and vanished into the folds of the paper. And in its place, the paper figure lifted its head. Its smile widened, and it whispered, "Your daughter belongs to me, but you will remember this forever." In the morning, Madame Lin's hair had turned white, not silver, white, as if every thread had been pulled through ash and regret. She never tried again, because the paper had proven what it was, unburnable. Not because it defied nature, but because it was nature now, bent, bound, woven into Lin's breath, her pulse, her voice. And every time she whispered his name in sleep, the room grew colder, the ink on the walls darkened, and the smile on the effigy deepened, ever so slightly. The wind changed that week, not in strength, but in direction. It no longer came from the mountains. It came from beneath the earth, and it smelled like sealed wood, like wet ink on folded parchment, like something once buried, now remembering how to breathe. Lian no longer answered to her name. When Madame Li called her, the girl would tilt her head and say, "That was my name, before the marriage." She walked differently now, slower, as if resisting invisible threads. And at night, she no longer lay in her bed. She stood, still, perfectly still, facing the window. Her mother once woke in the dark to find Lian outside, barefoot in the fog, spinning slowly beneath the moonlight with her arms raised, as if dancing to music only she could hear. And then the dream began. Lian told her mother she had dreamed of a red room, but it was not her bedroom. There were candles, she whispered, but they dripped upward, and I danced with him. With who? Lian didn't answer. Instead, she took a piece of joss paper and began folding it, not into a crane, not into a lotus, but into the shape of a human hand. When she finished, she pressed it to her cheek and smiled. Madam Li returned to the shrine one last time, not to pray, she had stopped doing that weeks ago, but to uncover what the villagers had erased. There, in the stone ledgers behind the altar, beneath dried vines and dust, she found it, the record of the dead, of those buried dishonorably, of those whose spirits were never sent off. She found the name that had been scratched out long ago, only partially visible now beneath ink stains and torn parchment. Shen Guanyu. Beside it, no death date, no burial location, only 3 characters scrawled in warning. Li Sang, buried standing. Her hands shook. She flipped the page. An old monk, blind in one eye and missing half his tongue, saw her from across the shrine. He hobbled close and whispered, voice like dried reeds snapping in the wind. They buried him on his feet, so he would never lie down, so he would always face home and wait for a bride who would never come. That night Madame Li returned and watched her daughter sleep. Lian murmured in her dreams. She reached out in the dark, her hand making slow circular gestures, as if tracing the hem of a robe, as if gripping a hand not made of flesh. The candle flickered, her lips parted. He told me he waited underground, with his eyes sewn shut, but he never stopped facing the house. Tears welled in Madame Li's eyes. "I'm sorry, my daughter. We should never have answered his knock." Lian stirred, then smiled. "It wasn't you who opened the door, Mother. It was me." The next day, Madame Li traveled to the burial fields of the Shen family, but there was no grave with Guan Yu's name, only a flat patch of earth, dry and sunless, marked with paper ash scattered into rings, as though offerings had been burned there for years with no recipient to claim them. But beneath the silence she felt it, a pressure, like something beneath the soil was watching, listening. She knelt and placed her ear to the ground. No heartbeat, only breath. Slow, measured, as if someone were standing beneath the earth, waiting to exhale. That night Lian did not speak. She lit 7 candles, arranged them in a circle, removed her shoes, and stood in the center. Madame Li watched from the doorway. "Lian, please stop." Her daughter didn't respond, only lifted her arms and swayed. The shadows moved unnaturally, as if another figure were dancing with her. But there was no one, only the smell of damp parchment, of old thread, of paint that had never dried. Madame Li crept to the altar, desperate. She tried to burn every wedding relic, the fan, the red ribbon, the invitation scroll, even the embroidered silk sash her daughter had worn that night. But none of it would burn. Instead, they turned black, then folded themselves back into shape, as if rejecting the fire, as if remembering who they belonged to. Lian fell into a deep sleep that night. She did not wake. Her breath was steady. Her eyes twitched beneath their lids, and in her dreams she smiled. She stood once more in the red-lit room, but this time it was underground. The ceiling was made of folded paper, the floor of pressed ash, and in the center he waited. Shen Guanyu. He wore his burial robes. His hands were inked with calligraphy, vows painted across his knuckles. His mouth did not move, but his eyes, dark, sunken, whole, never looked away. He held out his hand. Lian took it. They danced in silence, The music came from the walls, from the turning of prayer wheels never touched by living hands, and above them 7 candles dripped wax that never cooled. Madame Lee awoke before dawn. She rushed to her daughter's room. Liane still slept, but her hands were stained with soil, and under her nail fingers red thread, tied in knots, each one marked with a character, each one a vow.
They said the dead don't marry twice, but those who said it never heard the groom whisper. In the weeks that followed, the paper in the house grew thicker, not in layers, in presence. Madame Lee would find wedding charms scrawled on the floor even though no brush had touched it. Strips of old red paper began to appear under pillows, under bowls, under fingernails. And Liane began folding herself. She crossed her arms tightly at all hours. Her spine arched slightly forward, and her voice came not from her chest, but somewhere deeper, somewhere hollow. One morning she stood at the altar and whispered, "He says it wasn't finished. That paper was never enough. He wants marrow, memory, me." That day, the matchmaker returned. She did not bring lanterns. She brought a mirror. It was long, framed in ash wood, and veiled in black silk. She set it down at the threshold of the red room and bowed once. "It is time," she said. "He has prepared the new chamber. The binding must be complete. A second wedding, a deeper vow." Madame Lee shook her head. "We already gave him the rites. We already gave the offering." The matchmaker did not blink. "You gave him paper. He wants what lies beneath the ink." They dressed Liane again, but this time there were no silks, only red gauze layered thin over skin so pale it almost glowed. Around her wrists were threads tied with small bones, knuckles perhaps. Around her throat, a single charm etched with the word, "Fou," submit. Madame Lee wept as she watched her daughter step barefoot onto the path. The villagers closed their doors, but none locked them. They knew better than to pretend they weren't watching. The bride walked alone, toward the field where no grave was marked, where the earth pulsed with memory, where something once buried standing had begun to kneel. At the edge of the field stood an archway. It hadn't been there the day before. It was made not of wood, but of bone, polished smooth, lashed together with red twine and strands of hair. Beyond it, smoke drifted without fire. Lanterns hung from nothing, and the wind hummed with a voice that spoke no words, only invitation. Liane passed under the archway and vanished. Madame Lee screamed. She tried to run into the field, but her feet sank with every step, not into mud, into folded earth, creases that pulled at her like fingers, whispering, "Not yours, not your wedding." She collapsed, trembling, watched the arch shrink behind mist, and then the fog parted, and she saw it, a red pavilion, risen from the earth like memory unearthed. Inside stood the groom, no longer paper, no longer folded. He wore robes stitched with sinew, not thread. His face was pale, but no longer painted. His eyes were pits of dark ink that moved, alive, knowing. And stitched across his chest, where a heart should beat, was Liane's name, over and over, sewn in thread the color of dried blood. She stood before him, barefoot, head bowed. He raised a veil made of incense smoke and kissed her forehead with lips that had not kissed in life. The sky did not darken, it simply turned silent. The birds did not flee, they fell from the air. The second wedding had begun. The matchmaker officiated. Her voice was not her own. She spoke in old dialects, in syllables older than ink. She poured wine that steamed with ash. She lit candles that wept wax the color of bone marrow. And Lian spoke her vows. I bind my breath to yours, my bones to your silence, my soul to the waiting. And the groom replied, I fold you into me, not as a bride, as a mirror. Then they bowed 3 times, not to the heavens, not to the earth, but to the burial pit where he had once stood alone. As the ritual ended, a bell tolled once in the distance, but there was no temple, only silence. The groom reached out, and Lian took his hand. For the first time, her mother saw her smile with all her teeth. They stepped into the pavilion. The curtain fell. The mist closed. And when it lifted, only ashes remained, not scattered, folded into the shape of 2 figures, bowing toward each other forever.
They say a candle flame dances when it fears the dark. But what if the flame never moves? What if it burns without breath, without wax, without end? What if it isn't fire at all, but memory refusing to die? When Lian returned to the Li home, she did not come through the door. She appeared in the red room, as though she had always been there, as though she had never left. The bed was gone, the walls lined now with parchment prayers, the floor painted with circles drawn in ash, and in the center of the room stood a single candle, tall, slender, its flame unmoving, not flickering, not wavering, just burning. And Lian sat beside it, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face calm, and her eyes strange. Madame Li rushed to her. Lian, my child, where have you been? What did he do to you? Her daughter blinked slowly, then tilted her head. Who is Lian? Madame Li froze. You're my daughter. A pause, the sound of wax melting, but the candle did not shrink. I was her, the girl said, softly, before I was lit. From that day on, Lian no longer left the red room. She spoke only when the candle flared, which it did not do from wind, but from names spoken aloud. When Madame Li whispered, Guan Yu, the flame bent toward her. When she whispered, Lian, it pulled away. It had become a listener, and the room around it obeyed. Each night, Madame Li brought her daughter rice. Each morning, it remained untouched. But Lian did not starve. Her skin stayed smooth, her lips warm, her eyes endless. And though she never touched water, her hair never tangled. It always lay in perfect folds, like calligraphy dried in still air. One night, Madame Li tried to extinguish the candle. She cupped her hands. She blew. Once, twice, a third time. Nothing. The flame leaned toward her, and in the smoke she saw a face, not her daughter's,
The grooms, painted now with real flesh, smiling, waiting. She fell backward, weeping. "What are you becoming?" she sobbed. Lian answered without looking up. "I am not becoming. I am being remembered." She spoke in dialects her mother didn't recognize. Ancient tones, heavy vowels, words once spoken only in burial songs. She began writing in script no one taught her, symbols etched in soot on the wall beside the shrine. When Madame Li tried to scrub them away, her palms blistered. "You shouldn't erase prayers," Lian said gently. "They are for the ones beneath." The house changed with her. Doors swelled with moisture, though the air stayed dry. Mirrors cracked inward. Flies gathered on windows, but died without buzzing. And in the night she heard chanting, not from her daughter, from beneath the floorboards, as if something had moved in below, a wedding procession, rehearsing forever in the dark. She begged the priest again. He came, but when he stepped into the red room, his candle went out. The flame died in his hand, and the eternal candle, still, bright, smiling. He dropped his charms and fled. "There's no girl in that room," he said. "Only a name, and it's no longer hers." One morning, Madame Li found a new object in the shrine, a small paper effigy, folded with intricate care. It bore her daughter's face, painted in ink, its chest marked with the word Ian, flame. She tried to burn it, but when she touched a match to the paper, her own fingertips smoked. The effigy remained whole. The wax on the shrine melted instead. Time stopped mattering. Lian no longer asked about days. She no longer blinked in sunlight. She existed only by the glow of the unburning flame. And when her mother once asked, "Do you remember the river, the birds?" she responded, "I remember folding birds, but not flying." The candle never burned lower. Its wax stayed tall, its flame never consumed. And each night, Lian would sit beside it, her head tilted, her lips parted in song that had no melody, only rhythm, like paper sliding, like thread tightening, like vows repeating. Madame Li stood at the door, too afraid to enter, too afraid to leave. And she knew then, this was no longer a room. It was a waiting chamber for someone whose name had already burned, but whose presence could not be extinguished. Because even fire, once bound by memory, becomes something else. It becomes devotion. The ancestors in Qing Shui had always been silent. Stone tablets sat in shrines, weathered by incense smoke. Their names were prayed to, bowed to, respected, but never questioned, never blamed. Until now. It began with a crack. Not thunder, not wind, but the sudden, sharp sound of stones splitting. Madame Li, wandering the shrine at dusk, found it behind the main altar, an old ancestral tablet that had fractured down the center, as if something beneath it had grown tired of being remembered wrong. The name was nearly faded, unreadable, but the feeling was not. Grief, heavy, watching. That night she went to the oldest woman in the village, a midwife who had not delivered a child in 20 years, a widow who had lived through 3 floods and 4 famines, a woman who had buried both her sons and never once cried. Her eyes were nearly blind, but her memory, they said, was sharper than a blade. Madame Lee knelt at her mat. "Please," she begged, "tell me if this has happened before." The old woman did not speak at first. She only reached for a bundle of faded talismans and unwrapped them with shaking hands. Inside was a portrait, drawn in charcoal, of a girl in red robes, her face blurred with age, but her hair pinned with the same waxed ribbon Lian now wore. Beneath the portrait was a name, crossed out in black, and beneath that, 4 words: Jagwe Welhu, married to a ghost. The old woman whispered, "She was chosen, like your daughter, long ago, before the war, before even I could speak. Her family had angered the ancestors, so they gave her to the one who stood buried." Madame Lee's heart pounded. What happened to her? The old woman blinked. She danced for him for 7 nights, and on the 8th morning she was gone. Gone? Only her shadow remained, burnt into the wall behind the shrine. It never faded until the wind took it away. Madame Lee returned home and searched her daughter's room. Lian sat, as always, beside the candle that would not die, but behind her, on the wall, bare and pale, was the beginning of a mark, a darkening outline, faint but real, shaped like her seated frame, arms folded, head tilted, her shadow beginning to imprint itself, not cast by light, but left behind. She wept. "Lian, please, come back to yourself." Lian turned. Her face was soft, serene. "I am not leaving, mother." "But you're fading." Lian smiled. "Not fading, folding." Her voice grew lighter in those days, like it was coming from the walls instead of her chest. She no longer ate, no longer blinked. She barely breathed, but she laughed sometimes, quietly, like remembering a joke whispered by someone standing just behind her. When Madame Lee asked her why, "Because he told me I'm almost ready," she said. "Soon I'll weigh as much as paper, and then I can fly with him." The villagers began to notice ink stains in their homes, wedding ribbons in their food bowls, murmurs in the bamboo groves at dusk. One boy claimed he saw Lian walking above the pond, her feet never touching the water. Another swore he heard her singing to a man with no face. And always the wind carried that same scent: ash, melted wax, and something like grief. Madame Lee went to the shrine once more. She lit incense, she bowed, but this time she did not ask the gods for help. She spoke directly to the ancestors. "You made this. You wrote his name, then tore it away. You buried him upright so his rage would face home. And when he called, you let him. If you are gods, if you are memory, then remember this: I will not bury her. I will not let her vanish. You can keep your son, but not my daughter." The incense cracked, the smoke turned inward, and behind her the prayer bell fell from its hook. It rolled in a perfect circle, then stopped, facing the red room, as if pointing the way. Madame Lee returned home. Lian was still seated beside the candle, but her body was more outline than form. A whisper of cloth, a sigh made of silk. Her voice reached out, barely audible. "He's almost finished painting me. Soon I'll be dry. Then I'll belong." Madame Lee knelt, took her daughter's hand. It was cold, but not dead. Still pulsing, still hers. "No, child," she whispered. "You don't belong to him. You belong to me, to the ones who raised you, to the world that breathes." Lian blinked, and for the first time in many nights, a tear rolled down her cheek. Just one, but it left a trail of ink.
Just before dawn, when the sky is neither night nor morning, the villagers began to hear footsteps. Slow, deliberate, neither heavy nor light, just present. Like someone walking not on the earth, but through it, and always the same direction, from the edge of the old burial field to the Lee house. Those who woke early told the same story. A man, or the shape of one, tall, dressed in red, head bowed, skin like parchment soaked in soot. His body moving like folded cloth, limbs jointed at strange angles, as if stitched into motion, not born into it. They never saw his face, but they always saw what he left behind. Small paper footprints, outlined in ash, still warm when touched. He would walk to Leon's door, kneel, and wait for exactly 3 breaths, then rise, turn, and vanish. No one dared to interrupt him. Even the dogs, who barked at spirits and strangers alike, fell silent in his passing. Inside the house, Leon felt him. Even before he arrived, she would stir before the candle flickered. Her hands would fold neatly in her lap. Her breath would slow, and her voice, barely more than a thread, would whisper, "He's here." Madame Lee stopped trying to stop him. She simply sat beside her daughter, counting the footsteps outside, watching as each time Leon's eyes grew dimmer. Not blind, not lifeless, just distant, as though part of her had stepped outside, kneeling beside him in spirit, while her body remained seated in the room. One morning, Madame Lee opened the door. There was nothing on the threshold, but the floorboards held new marks. A folded origami crane, its wings inked with vows, its beak painted shut, and on its chest a single word, Juan, meaning exchange. Leon began speaking in riddles, not madness, but words that made sense only if you listened through silence. He walks because I won't. I sleep so he can remember. He kneels because he still hopes, but hope folds slowly. When I stop breathing, he will forget, and then he can sleep. Madame Lee begged her to eat, to drink, to remember herself. But Leon smiled softly. "The body is paper, mother. It folds when it's ready." On the 7th morning, the entire village felt it. A stillness so vast, even the birds paused mid-flight. Even the trees held their breath. The matchmaker reappeared in the village square. No one saw her arrive. She placed a single item on the well's edge, a scroll sealed in red wax. Then she left. No one touched it, except Madame Lee. The scroll contained a ritual, not to banish, not to cleanse, but to honor. To close what was once opened, the living must bow in place of the bride. To break the cycle, she must remain seated as he rises. Do not touch, do not cry, do not name him. Let the final walk end without witness. That morning, Leon did not stir. She sat silently, hands resting on her knees. Madame Lee stood behind her, trembling. Outside, the footsteps came again, but this time slower, heavier, not like paper, not like prayer, like bone. She felt him pause outside the door.
She felt the floor groan. She felt the air twist. And then, nothing. No knock, no creak, no breath. Just quiet. Leon spoke, her voice almost gone. He didn't kneel this time. Madame Lee's chest tightened. What does that mean? Leon turned her head, and for the first time in many days, her eyes met her mother's, still dim, but full. It means he's ready to stop walking. He's waiting for me to follow. That night, Madame Lee dreamed. She stood in the field, where no stones marked the dead, and before her knelt two figures, one in red, one in ash, their foreheads touching, their hands bound in a thread made of breath, and above them the moon blinked, once, and never opened again. She awoke weeping, clutched her daughter close. "Don't go, mother," she begged. Leon whispered in reply, "I already went, mother. I'm just waiting for the rest of me to arrive."
The final morning came without sound. No wind, no birds, no footsteps. Only stillness. The kind that does not wait, because it has already taken what it came for. Madame Lee awoke before the sun. Her bones ached with something older than sorrow. She had dreamed of thread. A single red string wrapped endlessly around her hands, binding her to a door that no longer existed. And when she opened her eyes, she knew Leon was gone. She rushed to the red room. The candle still burned, tall, still, eternal. But the chair was empty. No blood, no sign of struggle. Just the impression of where her daughter had sat, like heat long gone, like memory pressed into wood. The walls were quiet, the air cold, and in the center of the room sat a paper fan, unopened. Drawn on its surface, a bride and groom, seated, smiling. The villagers said the matchmaker had been seen one final time, walking alone toward the burial hills, carrying a bundle wrapped in red silk, her robe trailing dust, her feet leaving no prints. She never returned. Madame Lee did not weep that day. Instead, she dressed in white. She walked to the shrine with the steadiness of someone who had forgotten how to fear. And when she reached the altar, she saw them, Leon and the groom, seated side by side, still, silent, perfectly posed, as if waiting for someone to take a portrait or light the match that would seal their vows. Leon's head rested gently on his shoulder. Her hair flowed down her back like ink across parchment. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, palms facing upward, holding nothing. But her mother knew she was holding peace, or perhaps the memory of it. The groom's face was no longer painted. It was real, but it shimmered at the edges like heat above a funeral pyre. And his robe, stitched with her name, was now blank. The ink had faded, because she no longer needed to be written. She was. Madame Lee stepped closer, whispered her daughter's name one last time. "Leon?" No reply, only a breeze, cool, soft, and with it, her daughter's sleeve lifted, thin, too thin, translucent. The skin beneath it was not skin at all, but paper,
pressed, crisp, etched with faint lines, not veins, but folds. That night she lit the room. She laid firewood around the base. She poured oil beneath their feet, and she whispered a prayer not from the scriptures, but from her own throat, a mother's vow. If you are folded, then I will let you go, but not forgotten, never forgotten. She lit the flame and watched. The fire grew fast, hungry, silent. It devoured the walls, the altar, the candle that wouldn't die, but not the figures. Not at first. They sat untouched, as though the flame bent around them. And then the groom ignited, slowly, gracefully, a spiral of ash curling up from his hands. His body collapsed inwards, fold by fold, until all that remained was smoke. But Leon remained, for a moment longer, her eyes still open, her mouth still smiling, her fingers still outstretched as if waving goodbye. And then a final gust of wind, and she came apart, not like paper burning, but like memory unraveling, thin, soft, like silk becoming mist. In the end, only one figure left ash behind, the groom. The paper bride, she left nothing. No ash, no scrap, no trace, just stillness, and a breeze that smelled faintly of red ink and folded dreams. The villagers rebuilt the house years later. They never spoke of what came before, but the red room was never touched. They boarded it up, plastered it over, planted trees outside its walls, and still, on some mornings, a single folded crane appears on the doorstep, its wings inked with vows, its beak painted shut, waiting.